Hey guys, this is Aiden with Odin Coding, and today we're going to be talking about the Fetch API built into JavaScript. This is a tool that's going to allow us to make API calls. We're going to use get, post, put, patch, and delete, which are the 5 most common. And we're going to make them to a local server, but this of course can be applied to any API endpoint. So to build my local server, I actually used a node package called JSON server, which allows us to run a server locally. And you can see I have this JSON object that represents the database. So if we run this local server, we can actually see the endpoint on our browser under localhost 3000/flowers. We have our objects with ID, name, image, and sun exposure. And the URL here just points to a local directory which has some flower images already in it. But you can of course point your URL to an actual website or image URL you find on the computer. And the index.html file here is just some boilerplate code that's going to allow us to add new flowers. You see we have some inputs in a form here and an example card inside a grid. That way we know what kind of flower card we're trying to build. So if we go over here to index.html and right click, we can open with live server, and that's going to allow us to see our code running. Once we run live server, you can see here we have our index.html displayed in the browser. We have our input elements, our add button, and this is all encompassed in our form. And we have our flower card example here. And of course, none of this will do anything until we add the logic in. So the 5 types of HTTP requests we're going to work with today are get, post, patch, put, and delete. And these are just the 5 basic requests you'll be sending most often. We'll start off with the get request. And with the fetch function, the first argument it's going to take is going to be the actual URL endpoint of where we're going to be getting this data in this case. So we'll be using localhost 3000/flowers. In the event we're doing a post or a patch, we are going to take a second argument, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Now fetch is going to return something called a promise, which in JavaScript is an asynchronous object. So what we need to do is write .then, which is basically going to allow us to handle this asynchronous data. We're going to get the response back and then parse the response into JSON, same data we have here. And after we get that JSON data back, for now, we are just going to console log it so that we can see it on the screen. Keep in mind, flowers here doesn't actually mean anything. We could write any word here we want. This is just a variable that's going to represent the data that we get back from our API call after we've parsed it to JSON. And I realize the text is a little small here, so I'm going to go ahead and close the side panel and zoom in on the text just to make it easier to read. And now if we navigate to our browser and open the developer tools and look at our console, we see this array of flower objects, which exactly corresponds to the API here that we've created. And this is the basics of a simple fetch request. So this next part I'm going to speed through a little bit, but basically what we want to do is for every flower object that's returned in our array of flowers, we want to create a new flower. So we're going to go ahead and write a function that we can call for each object, as you can see on line 8 for each. And that's just going to use DOM manipulation with vanilla JavaScript to create a flower. You can see I'm creating elements, I'm giving them class names so we can add some CSS, and I'm assigning the inner text, just the variable flower is going to be what we pass. So flower.name, image URL, and sun exposure is exactly what we're going to be passed back from the API. So now that we have these 4 attributes of the flower card, we need to go ahead and create some type of element to actually wrap them all in. That way we can append it to the page, just kind of how our flower card already exists in our hard-coded HTML. So I'm just going to create a div here, and I'm going to give it a class of flower card because that's how we reference it in our CSS. So to go over this notation a little, you just add class name equals, and then as a string or in quotations, you add the name of your class. And we're going to append each individual element into this larger element. So that's going to be the name, the delete button, the image, and the sun exposure. And these are going to be ordered specifically to line up with the way my CSS handles styling the card, but obviously if you do your own CSS, you can do these however you want. And now we need a place to actually put this flower card. So what we're going to do is reference this flowers grid. We're going to use a document.querySelector assigned to a local variable, and we'll call that flowers grid. And we'll just enter the class name here to grab it from the HTML. And we're going to append that flower card inside of the grid, and it'll look just like our original flower card does. And basically what we're doing here is using the same element, the same data we get back from our API. Each individual flower is going to be added to the flowers grid the exact same way, just by calling one function for as many flowers as we happen to have in our API. So if we look in our browser, you can see we rendered all the new 3 of our flowers, and it's working fine. So the next thing we're going to do here is write our delete request. And as I mentioned earlier, we're actually going to pass this fetch request a second argument aside from just the URL we're contacting. What I'm going to do first is go ahead and write a function to wrap this in. That way we can call it whenever we want. We're going to pass it a flower object, and that's going to reference whatever flower we click on in this case. And we can open up our fetch, and you'll see this time we're actually using backticks. So this is so that we can interpolate a JavaScript variable into our string here. And this just means that we're going to be able to use not only string letters, but as well whatever we can grab out of our variable. So we're actually going to write /$ open bracket flower.id close bracket. And this is going to grab the flower ID out of the flower object. It'll correspond to any of these 1, 2, or 3 IDs, or any ones we add in the future, so that we know exactly which flower we are editing, or in this case, deleting. This second object is going to have a couple properties, but the first one is going to be a method, which tells us what type of HTTP method we are completing. In this case, it is a delete method, so we write that in a string in all caps. And the next is headers. Now, you don't need to know too much about this, but it's important to know that this is what's going to allow us to communicate with the API using JSON data. That's why we write application/JSON here. And these are the only 2 properties you need. But this second argument is necessary in a fetch request when doing anything other than a GET request. We're going to treat the rest of the fetch more or less the same, where we're going to do a .then to handle this asynchronously. We will take the response and parse it to JSON, and then we will do a .then and just log the data. And this last step is technically not necessary in this sense, but it does make it a little easier to keep track of what we're doing with our data and how it looks after we've performed our fetch request. So just to run through this one more time, we have our fetch request, which is acting as a function that will take the address, which is our URL. We're going to interpolate the flower ID into it, and flower is what we're going to pass our whole function this fetch is wrapped in. And the second argument is an object with the properties of method, which will be equal to delete. And this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. This is letting you know that the HTTP method is delete. So I'm going to go ahead and make a note of that here. And the headers argument here is just going to indicate that we'll be passing JSON data. That's the content type. And the rest is treated just the same. We are going to parse our response into JSON. And like I said, line 49 is not 100% necessary, but it logs the data, helps us keep track of it. So I actually see one error here, and that is that the E is missing from flowers, and that's going to throw us all off if we don't fix that. So now we have a function that deletes a flower, but we're not actually calling this function anywhere. So we're going to go ahead and go up to this function that allows us to create our flower card. And we're going to reference our delete button. That way, every time we click our delete button, we can delete a flower. So we'll use the add event listener JavaScript method. We'll listen for the click event because we're going to click on that button. And we will call our function here, which is delete flower, and we'll pass it the flower. And if you remember, this flower object here is going to be the same one that we're getting from the array from the db.json file that we defined. And there is one more very important thing I want to point out before we save any of our work or try to run this, is that we need to make this an arrow function because we've defined it as an arrow function. Basically what this is doing is if we did not make this an arrow function, this delete flower method would run every time that this card is created. And you can see I've done that already and my flowers array is empty. So a really handy thing I recommend is to create a backup file. And you can see I'm going to go to dbbackup.json and just copy all the data. And it's the same exact array of flowers we started with. And luckily this is a live server, so I don't even have to restart my API or anything like that. And I'll just paste that data right in here. So now if we refresh, we see our flowers. We can click on one, it will delete. And if we go to our API, we might have to refresh it. And you can see that flower has been removed from our pseudo database. So before we go any further, I just want to copy all the information from my backup database and post it into my regular one, so we have a full array of flowers to work with again. And the next thing we're going to do is write a post request. So a post request does pretty much what it sounds like. It allows us to add or submit data to our database, and in this case we'll be adding another flower to our array. And what we're going to do is use this flower form in our index.html, and we're going to grab all these values and create a flower object and then pass that to our fetch request to post it. So first we can reference that flower form by using document.querySelector, and we'll just put in the class name here with a period to preface it, just like we've done before. And we're then going to create a function, we'll just call it addFlower, and we're going to call this whenever we submit our form. So this means we're going to pass it an event object. And this event is occurring in JavaScript whenever we submit a form. This is a submit event. And by default, this will refresh the page. So what we need to do is do event.preventDefault, and that's going to allow the page to not refresh and not cause a lot of unforeseen errors that aren't going to help us with our code at all. And there is one thing I want to talk about here really quick, and that is, since we are running a live server, if you remember when we opened our index.html, we just sort of right-clicked and hit Open Live Server. The page may refresh anyway whenever we submit this event. Normally in JavaScript, you want to use this event.preventDefault, especially if you're doing something like if you run open index.html in your console in order to view your HTML, or maybe if you're using React or something like that. But this is just kind of standard practice as of now. It may be deprecated in the future, but you may still see a refresh because of live server. I recommend keeping this line of code anyway. So now I want to demonstrate exactly how we're going to get the values from this form. You can see we passed the addFlower function this event object like we talked about, and we're actually going to use something called event.target. So here you see we have all the values inside of our form HTML tag. And I'm going to go ahead and console log event.target. And that's going to allow us to view exactly what we're going to be working with to extract the data that we're going to input. So we can add our event listener here to the flower form. And the event that we add is going to be a submit event rather than a click event like we have previously, because rather than just listening for the button click, we're actually listening for the submit event that occurs when the form is submitted. And here you can see we're passing E just to represent the event itself that emits from the form. If we go over here to our browser, and if we open up our developer tools, underneath the array we logged earlier, we can now see our form. And here you can see exactly how it looks in the HTML. That includes our image, our name, and our sun exposure. And we're going to access the data through this target array. So in order to start working out this function, we can get rid of our console log, and we're going to actually create an object that's going to represent our new flower. We're going to pass that new object with a fetch request to create it on our JSON database. So you can see I'm just using some standard JavaScript here to make this object. We're going to use event target as I showed in the developer tools, and the index there with target 0 is based off where it falls in the order of the index.html. So you can see name, sun, and image are 0, 1, and 2. So we'll do sun exposure event.target 1.value. And this isn't the only way to write a form in JavaScript, and it's definitely not the best way, but it's quick and it works. When you start getting into frameworks like React or Angular, there's way better ways to handle form input, but this is going to serve just fine for the purposes of this video. And now we can write the actual fetch request. So just as we did before, we're going to pass it an initial argument of our API endpoint, which will be HTTP localhost 3000/flowers. And we are also going to pass it a second argument, and that is going to have some properties, the first of which being method. And in this case, the method is post. We're also going to pass a body, and this is important for a post request because this is going to be the data that we're actually sending. So here we're going to do json.stringify new flower, and that line does just about what it sounds like. It's stringifying the new flower object we just created into JSON data so that the API can work with it. And lastly, we're going to add headers to accept content type of application/JSON. So the most important difference here is that we now have a body that we're stringifying to send to the backend. And we technically don't have to do anything with the response here, but I like to keep track of the data. So I'm going to go ahead and parse the initial response into JSON data. And then I'm going to console log that so we could see exactly what the server is returning after we send a post request. And this should be set up for our post request to work. Let's go add a new flower. And before we go any further, I just want to point out a little typo I made here that's going to make all the difference. If we go here and change the lowercase u to a capital U, if we did not change this, this is not going to properly give us an image URL for our flower. It's going to think that it's creating a brand new property called image URL totally lowercase, and we're not referencing that anywhere. So let's try this out in the browser. We can grab an image URL from Google Images. We'll just copy the image address here. We're going to call it Daisy. We're going to say it is part shade, even though daisies are full sun, but we won't tell anyone. And image URL, we can paste that there. And as you can see, we have our new flower card. And this behaves just as the other ones, which means we can delete it. And if we check our database, you can see that it is no longer there, so everything is fully functional. And if we look at this flower object here with flower.id, we're actually getting that from wherever we call edit flower. So if we scroll up, we can call edit flower whenever we click on the sun exposure p tag. So we can add an event listener to this just like anything else, just like a button or any other element. And whenever we click, we're going to call a callback function that calls edit flower. And we're going to pass edit flower the same flower object that this entire function is being passed, which comes up right here. And this flower is coming in from the array of flowers we get from our database, which we're calling with this for each function here. And now we can try out this functionality by clicking on our sun exposure p tag, and you can see it is changed to shady. And if we go to our database here, you can see it's not reflected until we hit refresh, and you can see that now our sun exposure is shady. And this of course will work with any of our flowers. You can switch them all to shady, hit refresh, and the database will reflect that. And I do want to talk briefly about another HTTP request that is put. We don't really use put very often. In fact, it's very similar to patch in the sense that you are replacing data. So you would do flowers/flower.id. You'll use the same ID to reference. But put is going to actually replace the entire object, whereas patch is just going to update it. Put might be equivalent to deleting something and then posting on top of it, which there will be cases where you reuse it, but for now I'm not going to write out a fetch request because it is written almost exactly like a combination of patch and post. And there you have it, folks. That is the basics of writing a fetch request in JavaScript with the Fetch API. Keep in mind, there are always going to be things you can add to this. I can do another video on adding credentials if you want to maybe use this for login functionality. Maybe I could add a video of actually using put in a scenario. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know what you guys want to see next.